all these things. So welcome. Thank you so much to Lisa Allgood for joining us for a second time for an update on COVID-19. And I'm going to open us with prayer before we jump in. So let's pray. Gracious and loving God, we know that you stand beside us and walk with us each and every day. You are with us in our homes, for those who go to offices and hospitals and grocery stores and other businesses. You are with all of us. We're so grateful for the ways you have met us during this pandemic. We're so grateful for the ways that you have shown your love in and through your church and your people. Be with us as we continue to learn, as we are grateful for all the scientists who are working so hard to understand this virus and find ways to combat it. Thank you for giving us an opportunity to learn tonight and think more deeply about how to make wise decisions for your church and for your people and even for ourselves. Be with us in this time. Help us hear and understand, and bless our presenter, Lisa, as she shares all of this information. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So I am so grateful to have Lisa with us. Lisa is a colleague of mine. She is the transitional leader for the Presbytery of Cincinnati and also a trained immunocytochemist. How did I do?
Well done. Good job.
So thank you so much. Lisa's been so generous with her time and with sharing her years of professional experience in the real world before God called her into this church world. So Lisa, please take it away, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yeah, the journey to impersonating a presbyter as an immunologist during a pandemic is evidence of God's sense of humor, but it's actually been a lot of fun, and I'm grateful to have Cindy as a friend and a colleague. So I'll give you a very quick snapshot of my background. I am an East Coast girl. I grew up in New York City. I graduated from the University of Medicine and Dentistry, New Jersey in 1985 with a degree in immunocytochemistry, and spent 36 years in the pharmaceutical industry. First with Merck Sharp and Dohme back east, and then 32 years ago moved to Cincinnati as Procter & Gamble was starting its healthcare journey. So I've been in Cincinnati for quite some time. The first part of my work life was in a laboratory. I ran a flow cytometry unit, which is a way to look at immune cells of the body and type them by the proteins they express. And that in doing that, you can tell how they're responding to insult, whether it's bacterial or parasitic, or in some cases viral. So the two viruses that I worked most closely with during that time was rhinovirus, so one of the virus types that causes a cold, and the other one was back then known as HTLV3 and 4, which became HIV. So I worked with the HIV virus. This was before there were personal computers. So this was a very, very long time ago. And I very quickly discovered that as much as I loved it, and Cindy, I'm still going to send you the picture of my flow cytometer because it's really cool. I'm way too social a person to spend the rest of my life in a little dark lab all by myself. So I moved into clinical research in the pharmaceutical world, taking first dose and then later on medicine into human testing, and then ended up working with boards of health on 5 different continents for different medicines, so at the FDAs of the world. So I have a pretty broad background in the kind of stuff that we're talking about tonight. So I'm going to start with just talking very briefly about what coronavirus is. Coronavirus is a single-stranded messenger RNA virus. So it's ribonucleic acid. It's basically a genome, so the RNA inside a fat and protein sac. You've all seen the pictures, the little protein spikes. I mean, it's a little scary when you see it. We've had coronaviruses around forever. 4 different strains of coronavirus cause colds. There have been 2 that have caused, I'll call them mini pandemics. They were scary at the time. They were highly fatal. They had a high mortality rate, but they didn't last very long. The immune system overcame them, and we ended up, we don't have vaccines for them, but they sort of disappeared. They're still around, but they're not highly infectious. One was SARS, came out of Singapore, and the other was MERS that came out of the Middle East. This one is a nasty virus. This one is highly, highly infectious. It causes significant disease in a number of different body cavities. It's not particularly fatal, but the long-lasting consequences of it are really now just beginning to be understood. And I think, preceding anything I tell you, I have to say we've only really known about this virus since December. So we've only known about it for 8 months. The first signal case was November 24th in Wuhan. So it's a new virus. Our bodies haven't seen it, our scientists haven't seen it, and we learn something new every day. And that's part of the reason that you probably have gotten some conflicting information over the last 8 months. Wear a mask, don't wear a mask, do this, don't do that, is we really are learning about it. So we're going to talk about the infectivity of it. I was telling some of the mid-council leaders today, there's some good news and some bad news that comes out every single day on this kind of thing. It's been shown now that 40% of the people who are actually actively infected and infectious are completely asymptomatic. So they have no symptoms at all. Another percentage, and it's probably another 20%, get such mild symptoms that they never get tested. They don't get the whole range of symptoms that are available. So if you don't get a fever, you don't get tested, you don't really know that you have it. The bottom line on that one is you don't know if you are across the table from someone who is infectious. You really just don't know it. The bad news that came out at the end of last week, it was had previously been shown that people are infectious for 2 days before they develop symptoms, if they're the type of people who are going to develop symptoms. A study came out yesterday, or Friday, I guess, that said they've now done a study that says you can be infectious up to 8 days before you develop symptoms. So again, you don't know if you're across the table from anyone. A lot of people ask, should I get tested? Well, that testing is a point in time. And depending on the type of test they give you will depend on the veracity of the results. But it also only tells you if you're infected at that point in time. If it takes you 2 or 3 days to get the results back, you could be infected in the next 20 minutes and that test is not valid. So it's a really nasty little virus to deal with. It is airborne. It is a microparticle, so it can hang onto dust particles and very, very small droplets, which means that's why you wear a mask. And you wear a mask as best you can all the time. Because you really want to prevent it from getting into the mucous membrane. That's its fastest route of infection. You can also, of course, get it by touching an infected surface and touching your eyes or touching a mucosal surface. They've shown that the virus lasts for about 3 to 4 days on an impermeable surface, something like a doorknob or a wooden pew, and about 1 to 2 days on a permeable surface, on paper or on a hymnal or something like that. We'll get back to that a little bit. The other scary thing about this is as they look at how the infections occur, there are 2 factors that determine how likely you are to be infected. One is the number of virus particles that you're exposed to. The other is the length of time you're exposed. And some studies have shown, most studies now have shown, that the maximum time to infection is only 15 minutes. Because these are shed so much, and if you're across from an infectious person, it's so highly infectious that you only have to be there for 15 minutes. So go back and think about your time in a sanctuary. If you're back inside, you're there for a half hour, 45 minutes. You hit that peak at 15 minutes into the service. So that's something else to keep in mind. U.S. unfortunately hit 5 million cases this week. We've hit almost 750,000 deaths. We are 15 times the infectivity rate of any other country in the world. We have not got this under control. It's why all of the rest of the countries of the world are not letting us cross their borders. Infectivity is correlated to age and underlying medical conditions. So while young people, including infants, can get infected, there was actually a case of a dog that died in North Carolina from being infected, so it's jumping species. The fatality rate tends to mimic age, and of course, hospitalization and ICU utilization, as well as fatality rates, also correlate to underlying conditions. So all of those are still true. That said, everybody can get infected and everybody is infectious. There is no point at which that infectivity curve crosses. Let's see what else. We are now up to about 54,000 cases a day. We are also at the point where we in the United States right now have a COVID-related death, however that is categorized, about every 15 seconds. So this is not one you want to miss with. The two things that are really not well understood about this virus at this point is related to the fact that the immune response to this virus tends to be very weak. There are antibodies that are produced, but the more mild your symptoms, the less those antibodies stick around and the weaker they are. Even those who have very serious sequelae have antibodies that don't stay around for very long. And so there are questions about whether or not, particularly if you had a mild form of it or an asymptomatic form of it, whether or not you can have a reinfection. It's not completely understood at this point. There was some evidence in Asia that there have been reinfections, but it's not completely clear. The other thing that's not known, and it hasn't really been tested, I've not seen data on it, is whether or not this virus will become latent. So if you think about the chickenpox vaccine that stays in your body and then later becomes shingles, it's not known whether this virus will or will not do the same thing. It's not a type of virus that normally does, but it's possible that it could. So knowing all of that, then you start to think about the symptoms that show up. The cardinal symptoms that you heard about early were fever, aches and pains, just like a flu, cough, a dry cough, so not a wet cough, shortness of breath, chest pain, that kind of thing. As we've learned about this virus, what we've learned is that this virus, for two reasons, affects multiple organ systems in the body. In addition to affecting the respiratory system, which is natural in an airborne respiratory derived virus, it's actually been found in heart tissue, it's been found in liver tissue, kidney tissue, gastrointestinal system, and it's found in the central nervous system. It's also recently been found in the pancreas. And because it affects the islet cells in the pancreas, not only is diabetes a predisposing condition, it can also actually cause diabetes. There have been a number of central nervous system issues that have arisen all the way up to seizures and psychosis. There is vascular effects, so it causes clotting in the large and small vessels, which means that those clots can lead to strokes and to other organ damage. It's also the kind of virus that, depending on the state of the immune system of the person who's exhibiting symptoms, it can cause what's called a cytokine storm. A cytokine is a chemical that's released from certain of the immune cells in your body that act to direct the immune cells to the site of infection. When that runs rampant, it can actually cause massive system and organ failure. And that's partly what's going on with some of the cases with this virus. So we've had things from cardiac arrest to permanent lung damage, and I'll give you some stats on that in a minute, to cognitive dysfunction, neurologic dysfunction, and those are permanent or long-lasting. Those are not short-lived sequelae. So if you go from symptoms to fatality, the fatality in young children, 5 to 17 years old, is about 0.3 per 1,000 cases. In an 85-year-old or above, it's 300 per 1,000 cases. So you can see that it rises exponentially, and it's everywhere else in the middle. That's about, the fatality rate overall is about 1%. That's 10 times higher than the flu. It's about 5 times lower than for something like Ebola, or even SARS and MERS had a much, much higher fatality rate, anywhere from 10 to 50%. For every one death, however, so 1% doesn't sound like very much, but for every one death, there are 19 more who require long-term hospitalization or ICU utilization. In the US alone, that's 62 million people. So you can imagine the cost to the healthcare is phenomenal. For every one person who dies, there are 18 people who have permanent or long-term heart disease and heart effects. That's another 59 million people. For every one person who dies, there are 10 people who will have permanent lung damage. I've seen the CAT scans of some young female cross-country runners, some of the healthiest lungs you're going to come across, and they have permanent what's called ground glass lesions in the bottom of the lung because of the infiltrate there. It's another 32 million people. For every one person who dies, you're going to have 3 strokes. For every one person who dies, you're going to have 2 who have some other form of permanent neurological damage. And for every one person who dies, you're going to have another 2 people on top of that who have permanent cognitive dysfunction. So the sequelae to this virus go way beyond some of the numbers that you normally see. The fatality rate, of course, is lower in the young. And actually what we're seeing now is more young people getting infected than originally. Originally, we were seeing them in nursing homes and key places like that. So as more young people get infected, the fatality rate tends to go down because they don't tend to die at the same rate. But nonetheless, the infection rate is about the same. And the sequelae can be just as bad.
So let's take
any questions?
A breath.
Yes.
and just really focus in on some of the very specific details that 15 minutes of conversation or 15 minutes in a space with a group of people. So think about a restaurant. You know, restaurants are reopened in many of our states and across the country. Think about sitting down for a meal in a restaurant. Of course, you're not wearing a mask because you are eating and drinking. If somebody there is sick, and they wouldn't know, 40% are asymptomatic, no symptoms. 15 minutes into that meal, you've reached the exposure point.
Right.
And Lisa hadn't even talked about airflow yet. Whew, you can buckle up for that one. So 15 minutes, keep that in your mind as you think about what we do in person. You can be infectious for 8 days, again, without knowing it. So for our context, that could be 2 Sundays. If a
Right.
church is gathering in person, that could be 2 Sundays. And even if you're gathering outside, if you have a conversation with another person in the church, if you're not practicing really careful social distancing, that 15 minutes goes by really fast when you haven't seen your friend for a long time.
Yeah.
So 8 days, that can be 2 Sundays. And again, that 40% number. Lisa was really generous. She said you could be sitting across from someone and not know if they're infectious. You could be sitting across from someone and not know if you're infectious.
Right.
I have friends across the US who have been so careful, other pastors who have been so careful and who have gotten sick. A young woman pastor I know who has gotten sick. It's been almost 2 months now.
Yeah.
And it keeps relapsing for her. She starts feeling better and then suddenly she has a fever and she can't get out of bed.
Right.
I think she's about 30.
Wow.
So these are serious things to keep in mind as we talk about how we are church together, how we care for the body of Christ, how we follow Jesus' commandment to care for the least of these in the Matthew 25 language.
That's right.
So Lisa, talk a little bit about airflow.
So yeah, we'll talk about the building part. Well, and I had a friend as well who's probably a little older than 30, but the same thing is true, has had symptoms on and off for 2 months. And the stat that I read said that of those who have any symptoms, even mild ones, only 12% are absolutely symptom-free at the end of 2 months. So these are long-term results from this kind of thing. And it's not the flu, it's not a cold, it's not a 7-day thing. So yeah, let's talk about, and then we can go into treatments and vaccines, we can go into the rest of the science stuff, but think about, put yourself in a sanctuary for a minute. So there are 3 things that we talk about when we think about going into a sanctuary. First, of course, it's summer, and Cindy said you guys are having a heat wave. We're a little less hot and humid than we had been, but trust me, it's hot in the Midwest too. You think about something like air conditioning or a ceiling fan or eventually heat. What happens is the air comes out of the machine and it pushes itself down onto the congregation and then it circles around, right? And then it goes back and gets recycled and then it gets pushed back down again and it cycles around a little bit. And I've had people say, but I have all these awesome HEPA filters and I have a UV something. And I'm like, that's great for about the first 10 seconds, the air leaves the machine and then it gets pushed down on your congregation and it gets circled around. And what's being circled around is exhaled, potentially infectious air. And so the kinds of guidance that we've been given, I'm now giving nationally, but at least I was giving in Cincinnati before, is if you have to use air conditioning, air condition the space for 24 hours before and then turn it off. So at least you don't have air circling around, so that you have quiet air in the sanctuary for the time people are there, and then you can turn the air conditioning back on later. And you can do the same with heat. Best thing you can possibly do if you've got them, and I'll tell you, I've got a lot of old buildings here in Cincinnati, you probably do as well on the East Coast. Our windows don't all open generally, but if you can find a way to create cross ventilation, that's the very best you can do, so that you've got a constant stream of replenished air instead of recycled air going around the building. There's one study, and this is only the one study we've got, but it is a good one in the sense that it shows the way the infection can travel. It came out of Wuhan, which is where the virus was initiated. It was a closed restaurant with no outside ventilation and an air conditioner. And they actually mapped the one guy who was infected and how he infected 9 people all around him. So it's not a constant airflow, it was all the way around. And so because the air was cycling around. So it is absolutely true that air conditioning, heat, anything that's going to cycle the same air around a congregation or around a room can possibly cycle around infectious air.
There's a question in the chat about forced hot water heat.
I have to confess, I don't know how that works.
But there's usually a blower.
Yeah, so I would imagine, and my father was a plumber and a heater guy, so he'd probably yell at me for not knowing this, but my guess is, unless you can create a single airflow across, where you're not cycling that air around in one way, shape, or form. So if it's being driven from one side of the room and it exits the other side of the room, and you can show that might be better. But you'd have to really show that, and I don't know enough about it. Radiant heat, it's the same thing in the sense that if you're in a closed, and I think this is really the salient point, if you're in a closed room with air being recycled in any way, shape, or form, radiant heat or not, you're going to have an increase in infectivity. The other thing to consider here is that the length or the distance that a virus particle will travel is partly based on physics. And it's partly why flu goes away in the hot humidity of the summer. This is the way this one apparently doesn't work. When you're in a hot, humid condition, mucus particles, water particles that come out of your mouth as you speak are bigger. And so they literally fall faster. They don't travel as far. When you're in a dry, hot area, those particles stay very, very small. And so they travel a much greater distance. And so with any heat, you're going to have increased infectivity anyway, just because those virus particles aren't literally falling in front of you. And so that's simple physics. That's true for all viruses. This virus did not behave like a flu virus. It did not go away in the summer, which was expected really when you thought about it. If you looked at places like Taiwan and Singapore, that's tropics. Even Wuhan is a tropic, and it was rampant there for the entire time. It never left the tropics. So it's not behaving like a flu virus. The other thing that we talk about in the context of a congregation, of course, is singing, and everybody wants to sing. I used to sing in New York with the New York Chorale Society. I love to sing, I get it, but I want you to think of singing as a 4-minute sustained cough. So a cough goes at 50 miles an hour. A cough will travel at least 24 feet. And if you're doing that for 4 minutes, you're putting a lot of potential infectivity out there. In Cincinnati, we are blessed to be aligned with the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. We have a lot of opera students that we put out into our congregations and pay them as music scholars. And for the churches that are still using them, they will have 1 or 2. So they'll have a soloist or a duet. They are masked for the entire service. It's for the couple of my churches that are back. And when it comes time to sing, they take the mask off. They are 24 feet away, and they actually sort of face away from each other. And in the church I'm thinking of, it's a huge church. It seats 500. They have 50 people in the pews, and we're Presbyterians. Nobody sits in the front seat. So we're at least 60 feet away from the congregation. And so that's about as safe as you can get. But I would absolutely say no choirs, no choir practice. That has shown to be a hot spot. One of the realities that we're seeing in the spikes that we're seeing, we were pretty good early on at suppressing the curve because everybody was quarantined. Nobody was wearing masks, but you were all home. Once those restrictions got lifted, it's actually the small gatherings in the community spread that's causing the spikes. It wasn't the protests. Those, at least in Cincinnati, the protests we had were masked. It's not increased testing. It's literally small gatherings like churches and choir rehearsals and wedding showers and funerals and backyard gatherings over the 4th of July. That's what's causing the spread. We had a church here, you probably saw it was on the national news. One gentleman went into a church service and infected 91 people. That crowded corridor of the school that you saw in Georgia has now resulted in the quarantining of 800 students and 42 staff and their families. So, so this spreads really, really fast. The number that you will see every once in a while, and we'll talk a little bit about how to look at the metrics, it's called an R number. And the R number, if it's above 1, means that you're infecting more than one person every time you encounter someone. If it's below 1, it means that the virus really isn't spreading very much because you're not constantly infecting someone. So when the virus hit New York City, the R number when it started was 4. That means if I'm infectious, I'm infecting 4 of you, and then the 4 of you are infecting 4 other people, and you've just wiped out this entire slate of people right here in 2 rounds. So this is really, really infectious. The last thing we talk about when you get back into the sanctuary is how many things do you touch? Now, it doesn't last very long on permeable surfaces or impermeable surfaces. However, you really want to limit the number of times people touch something or the number of people that touch it. So the admonition to leave the collection plate in the back and let people put their stuff in there. The prepackaged communion, the juice is horrible, but it's the easiest, cleanest way you can. Cindy's laughing because it really is bad. If you pass those out, at least it's one touch and that's it. And then it's contained. I've seen people do pass out communion bread with tongs and they're gloved and masked, and that's not a bad way to do it, but somebody had to prepare the bread. And so, again, you think about the number of times somebody or something touches it. We've had people take the hymnals out. Even though it doesn't last very long on a hymnal, why would you risk that? So they're now printing out the hymns, putting them into a bulletin and leaving the bulletins in the back so people can pick those up. It's little things like that it's just one extra layer of safety. The other big thing is to really limit access to parts of the building as much as you possibly can. If you've got one of those old churches that has a rabbit warren of Sunday school classrooms in the bottom, seal those off. Don't let people go down there. If they can just go into the sanctuary and then go out of the sanctuary, that's your best bet, because then you can literally seal the sanctuary off for a week. And same with the rest of the building, the kitchens, the fellowship halls, any place that people normally go. We've had questions about, what do you do about outside groups coming in? And again, we've said the same thing. Limit as many of those groups as you possibly can to a single room so that you're only trying to sanitize that room all the time at AA or Boy Scouts or something like that. Bathrooms, what we've had our churches here do for those that are back in, and I will tell you a lot of the churches that I've had that have gone back inside are now closed again. We haven't spiked that much, but it was enough to get people nervous again. We've actually had them mark off 6 feet in the hallway, one person in the bathroom at a time, and we leave alcohol wipes in there, and so they can wipe down everything that they may have touched, and then the next person can go in. So it's awkward. It's not a lot of fun. It's certainly not the worship service that you all loved and cherished, but there are ways to do it, I think.
Yeah. And
most of my churches right now are outside,
yeah.
and which I think is a great way to witness to the neighborhood. I love it, actually. I wish they'd do it more.
Yeah. And even saying that, even talking about the potential precautions and the things you can do, it's really important to be clear that you are only able to minimize risk. There is not a single way to gather as a group, either indoor or outdoor, I would say. Outdoor, right. There's less risk, right. But there is not a way to gather as a group for any period of time longer than 15 minutes that does not involve risk.
Right.
And for our sessions, you have to be really clear about that. It's not a question of if everyone's masked and we wipe everything down and we have one way in and another way out and we're really careful, then everybody will be safe.
Right.
You cannot guarantee safety with this virus.
Right. That's exactly right. And I think you raise a good point. I know in the sessions that I've engaged with here, they get fatigued really fast. They just don't want to talk about this anymore. And I've made sure to tell them, this is a really fluid situation. This virus is not going to go away. It's just not. And we'll talk about what vaccination will do for it later. But you're going to be making this decision multiple times. And so you need to make sure that you have a really good communication list so you can get with your congregation immediately if you need to close for any reason. If you've had an exposure in the sanctuary, the boards of health here are looking for who sat next to who so that they can do contact tracing. So a lot of the churches who are back are keeping lists of who's in the sanctuary every Sunday. Some are even taking cell phone photos so that they can see who's sitting next to who. And if you have an exposure here, you have to close, quarantine for 14 days, and you have to notify the Board of Health. And so there's a whole cascade of things that has to happen. But the sessions are going to, you're going to have to make a decision to close or not close on a periodic basis. And we are expecting this to get worse in the fall. One of the things that I've told them is, and I'll give you a website that you can go to that might help as well. Governor DeWine here, so my presbytery goes over 3 states. It goes into Indiana and it goes into Kentucky. But Governor DeWine in Ohio did us a favor because he put together a color-coded system to talk about the infection rate along 7 different independently looked at variables. So it's objective, it's scientific, it's consistent across the entire state. And I keep saying, use him as the bad guy. So if we're red or purple, you might want to think about closing. And when you get to orange, then you might want to wait 2 weeks because it could go back to red the next week, and you don't want to be doing that to your congregation. So we basically told people, find a single website. Either this one is called COVID Act Now, or the CDC website, which also allows you to go county by county, both of them do, and just use that in your rubric so that you always have something outside an objective to point to. And that way you're not constantly going, yeah, but the Catholic Church across the street is open. That's not the way to make a decision. Mm-hmm. And so they've actually done, thank you, that they've done a pretty good job of using that outside source for a decision tree. And we actually have a bunch of them here, which is really good to have in hand, because then your session can point to it and say, yes, we've mandated masks, you must wear a mask. That's session's job, not the pastor's job, to police that. And they can also say, here's the criteria that we've used to open and or close again. So it's consistent every single time. So that really
a lot of our churches will cover multiple counties.
Yes.
And so it's not just where the physical building is located, right. It's where are the members coming from.
Right.
And where are the members? So the members may be coming from places, but if they are back to work, where are they working? If you have members who are going to be going back to school, where are those counties? So it's good to have that right in front of you, but it's not as simple as, oh, the church is in Worcester County.
Right.
Yeah, what else is around there?
Well, and I've looked at the counties, both in the Boston Presbytery, but also in the Northeast. This holds true pretty much for everybody, but I mean, a lot of your counties are in pretty good shape right now, but it depends on why. So anything that has a big city like Boston or one of the bigger cities in the Northeast, you have a lot of ICU beds. So you're not going to go red on ICU bed utilization. You're going to go red, depending on what color you're using here, based on infectivity, on the infection rate and the number of new cases. In the rural districts, you're probably red because you have fewer ICU, even if you have very few cases. And so you sort of have to look into all of those reasons as to why you are where you are. But the COVID Act Now site will actually give you 5 different parameters that includes those kinds of things. And so it's a pretty good proxy for a way to just look at where your district is. And I like the idea that it's not just a county, it's a district.
Yeah.
That's right.
So let's touch on vaccinations really fast. We have about 15 minutes left.
Okay, yeah, so vaccination. So first of all, treatments are getting better. They've sort of figured out how to toggle between the beginning of the infection and the end of infection. So the beginning of the infection is an antiviral like remdesivir, you've seen that one. The end of the infection is an immunosuppressant like dextromethasone to keep that cytokine storm sort of under control. And they've got some other physical things that they're doing. Right now, we've got about 150 different vaccines in various stages of testing. There are 7 that have progressed to the end of what's called phase 2 into phase 3. Phase 3 are those big 10,000, 30,000 people trials. They're of different types. The 2 that are closest or the most progressed are mRNA viruses. They've actually taken snippets of the COVID mRNA and put that into an adjuvant so that the antibodies will respond to that. That's a viral type or vaccine type, sorry, that has never been commercialized in the US before. And it has to be kept at like negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's not an easy vaccine to create. If it is approved, it will be the first mRNA vaccine out there. There are several others, J&J, that's Moderna and Pfizer, that's the mRNA virus. J&J, AstraZeneca, Sanofi, GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, and Novavax all have what's called an attenuated virus. So it's a different non-infectious virus, but one that will actually get into the cell, and it has the protein marker, the protein spike marker on it, so that the antibodies that are, the immune system recognizes that spike, and it prevents a lot of the immunity. When you're looking at vaccination and you're looking at what that does to reduce the load of on the healthcare system, really what you're looking at is epidemiology here. You're not looking at, is it going to keep me safe? What you're looking at is it going to protect more than 50% of the population? So is it going to be effective in more than 50% of the population? You've heard about herd immunity, which is 70%. That tends to keep viral replication very low. The country of Sweden did us a favor and said that's not going to happen naturally because they did not have any precautions. They tried to go for herd immunity and they ended up having the highest per capita death rate in all of Europe. So even their medical community has said that was a failure. So the hope now is that the vaccination programs that are there, and the US government has given billions of dollars to advance this and has got it on an expedited timeline with FDA. It's likely we will have a vaccine first quarter of next year. And I say that, no scientist ever says likely, but I think it is likely that we will probably have one first quarter of next year. We won't have enough to get to herd immunity probably until halfway through the year, because we're going to have to make some choices about first responders, medical people, nursing homes. Those will be the first to get it. So most of your congregation will not be vaccinated until probably mid next year. But the good news is we're getting there. There really is amazing open source sharing of data now in the science community, the pharmaceutical community, which is a little unusual, both on the virus itself, on the medical sequelae, but also on the vaccination development. So it's actually been pretty good. Your kids are going back to school. God bless you and the teachers.
Amen.
Same rules apply. Mask, distance, hand washing. I don't know how they're going to handle recess, but I did see one of the kindergarten teachers here created these little pods that look like race cars, so that at least when they're in their little desks in kindergarten, they're having fun. I thought it was really cute. But yeah, going back to school, particularly going back to college, is going to be tough. Most of the colleges here are open now or will open in the next couple of weeks, but I know for a fact every single one of them has a closed program. That if they have to go back to virtual, they will.
Yeah.
So, questions?
Oh man.
I know it's rapid fire.
It is, and it's a lot of information. One of the things that I've encouraged churches to think about, so now that you've heard that 8-day infectivity, that you can be infectious for 8 days, that may help explain the 2-week quarantine that Maine requires, that Massachusetts now requires, and why that 2-week window is in place. So one of the things I've said to some of our congregations as they think about reopening is to think about that quarantine number and maybe not reopen right after a holiday weekend. Our next holiday weekend coming up is Labor Day, first weekend in September. So that is when people are more likely to go to the beach, go to a barbecue, be outside for a beautiful weekend before school starts, and whatever happens with that happens. So instead of coming right back to church, maybe wait 2 weeks.
Right.
I think about a community quarantine, and even invite your members. If a 14-day quarantine isn't required in your state, invite your members. If you go to a gathering, if you go to a wedding, if you go to a graduation party, if you go to a gathering, think about waiting 2 weeks before you go to an in-person gathering at the church. That is a way, again, we can help reduce the risk, not eliminate it, but reduce the risk of seeing one another.
That's great advice. It really is. One of the things that we have had a lot of discussion here is about how fruitful the virtual worship has been, and how in a lot of ways that's the better Christian witness, is to stay home and not put anyone else at risk, and not put your family at risk. And so as some of the churches have gone back, they've gone to hybrid, because they recognize the value of the virtual, and that they're actually witnessing to different people than would ever cross their threshold. But one of the pastors here made just a beautiful observation that as you go to that hybrid place, of course, the worship first has to focus on God, but the second focus for that worship should be the people online, because they are doing the better Christian witness. And if you all of a sudden are now focused back on the people in the pews in front of you, and you're sort of, they're out there in the internet land, it's a little bit like sending your kids to bed while the party's still going on downstairs, and you will lose them. And not only will you lose them, you've sort of just diminished them and their importance. And so it really has been a wonderful thing to watch how the churches have responded to that, because in fact, they're focused on the people who are watching online, and the people in the pews are there witnessing that. It's been a nice reaffirmation that, in fact, coming back together, first of all, isn't what it used to be. It's not the way that you used to worship before COVID, but it really isn't about the building. It really is about worshiping and giving people Christ and giving them the word. So that's actually been a good dialogue here.
And little preview of coming attractions. One of the things I'm starting to work on for the presbyteries, and again, any are welcome, is a webinar on how to do hybrid worship really, really well.
Nice.
Because I would love for, and I'll just put my personal preference right out there, I would love for our churches to stay virtual, to stay electronic until it's not about managing risk. I would love for that to be the decision, and to use this time to prepare for the day when it is safe, and be prepared to offer really good hybrid worship experience. So I'm going to be working on pulling together resources in a webinar for how do you do good hybrid worship.
That's great. And actually, we've had some conversations along those lines too, saying, how do you expand that beyond an hour on Sunday? Yeah. So how do you use that to bring in young families who really have a hard time getting that toddler to Sunday school on a Sunday morning, but might be able to gather 6 other families in their living room, socially distanced until we have herd immunity, on a Tuesday night, and watch the YouTube and create a small Bible study out of that. And so how can you use this to rediscover what is the core purpose? It's not just that hour on Sunday. It is living it out and really being able to spread it.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I mean, as awful as this virus is, the death toll is staggering. And we sometimes lose sight of the worldwide impact. Over 5,000 people a day are dying across the world. Over 5,000 people per day. It is a number you can hardly wrap your mind around. In my first call, the town I was in became a city while I was there, and that was a 5,000 person threshold. Once they had 5,000 people in their population, they became a city. That's that whole city
Yeah.
wiped out in a day,
Day.
every day for several months with no end in sight at this point.
Right.
That being said, we have some opportunities to be creative, to be flexible and adapt, to find new ways to be the body of Christ when we are dispersed and deployed. And the presbyteries here have heard me say that. This is the time where we live into a new form of witness. And it's for the world's sake, which is ultimately for God's sake too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Really deeply appreciate this. I know that you have said that you feel a little bit like Esther.
Not a
but,
queen. Let's get that clear.
but for such a time as this.
Yeah.
And so being so generous with your time, it is deeply, deeply appreciated. Thank you to everyone who joined us. I'm going to stop the Facebook live stream. Okay, and I'm going to stop the recording.